Well, I think the first one you have to talk about is arms control. We are still these two humongous nuclear powers, and the important thing to understand about non-proliferation is that it is more than just one crisis after another in different countries, Iran, North Korea, etc. There is a much broader global crisis of confidence or loss of faith in the non-proliferation regime under which the nuclear weapon states promised ultimately to disarm. And what the rest of the world sees is 15 years after the end of the Cold War, some progress in disarmament, but to them, nothing that suggests that the nuclear states are on a path to fulfill that commitment. At the same time, we are saying correctly that the regime needs to be strengthened. And so their willingness to hear anything about making additional commitments to the regime when the nuclear states seem to be making none is completely gone. So the U.S. and Russia are at the core of that. And one of the, to my mind, great mistakes that the Bush administration made was to say arms control is a waste of time. And I think we have to bring arms control back onto the agenda and start thinking about what a very different world looks like if we want not to have 20 or 30 or 40 nuclear states. So that's the number one issue. Equally important, Russia, I think, on Iran has played a fairly constructive role. They have kept to their contract on Iran's nuclear reactor at Bushehr, but they have dragged their feet. They've tried to postpone the moment when they have to provide nuclear fuel for the reactor to the very last second. They don't like UN sanctions for broader political, well-known, long-established reasons. And so they have held back progress in the UN, but it's not so clear whether that's because of those reasons or because they... so it's a little bit opaque. But they certainly have shown that they don't want to see Iran as a nuclear state either, and have been helpful in that regard to some extent. But that's a very big agenda to pursue. There are critical issues on climate change. Russia has not come to grips with the reality of climate change, or even with the reality that they could be rather significant winners under the Kyoto provisions. They just don't seem to get it yet. There are critical regional issues, and I think more of a worry than that there would be a domestic upheaval that brought international criticism would be, I think the bigger risk is probably a Russian move against Georgia or Kosovo, some other place outside Russia but in its neighborhood that that might cause a confrontation with the United States or with the West more generally. Then there is the whole issue of European dependence on Russian energy supplies and working out some modus vivendi there. That's a critical challenge. So there's a big agenda. And what's worrisome, as I said, is, we know that what President Bush thought he saw in President Putin's eyes didn't turn out to be there, and it certainly was never a basis for a relationship. That basis has really withered over the last 5 years. And in its place is, I think, more distrust, perhaps on both sides. And that is a big foreign policy concern, and one that the United States really ought to be addressing. Russia feels that in the 1990s it was humiliated by the West, told what to do, looked down on, and the more they talk about it, the more it gets blown up into this sense of humiliation. And now, with oil money, that's the big thing that has changed. There is a feeling that they can finally tell the West where to get off, and that Russia is back. And I think one thing we have to remember is this is a country that lost an empire overnight, and that's pretty hard to swallow. So now this sense of humiliation from the 90s is coming back, and at the same time, the U.S. isn't off the hook as part of the reason. We've pushed very aggressively to bring NATO up to Russia's borders. With the deployment of the announcement of the deployment of missile defense systems in the Czech Republic and Poland, we have, in the Russian view, just sort of, to the Russians, this looks like it's directed at them, not at a potential threat from Iran. And so we've been part of it, and also the very aggressive rhetoric about democracy. To them harkens back to a time in the 90s when they had to swallow whatever the U.S. said regardless, and now they don't because of oil money. And there has been other economic progress as well, although most of this enormous growth and recovery is due to oil money. Well, step by step, he has eliminated every other political voice in Russia. The governors of the various provinces around Russia, the independent television media, the other political parties, the oligarchs who had positions straddling the private sector and the state, to the point where now he really is the only political voice left. And what's distressing to American and sad, I think, for the Russian people is how recent those political freedoms were and how easily the Russian people gave them up. But I think that as non-Russians, as Americans, what we have to recognize is Russia is Russia. It's its own country, not one that we can dictate to. President Putin has really been extraordinarily successful in removing the potential political base from anybody and the political voice. And because of his control over the mass media, the only opportunity for anybody in the opposition to reach a large audience. So I just don't see it as having significance near term. This is a very difficult situation because for many years Russia did supply subsidized oil and gas to former countries of the former Soviet Union, in which it has a right to change its mind. But there's no question that the core issue here is that Russia intends to use its oil and gas power as a political tool, not an economic one, or not only an economic one. It is principally a political tool, and it's under the control of the state. This is the state's principal resource now. Can't really do much with nuclear weapons, but you can do a lot with oil and gas. And that's what Europe has to find some way to live with. There's been an enormous effort that I think Bill Gates has touched off of paying attention to Africa and to the most needy parts of the world. Lots of effort on healthcare and on education and on development generally. But there is so much going that it's really pretty much across the board on all kinds of things. I'd say, by and large, more of the giving is domestic, but that's always the case. This kind of money has the potential to set a goal and stay with it in a way that government has more difficulty doing, particularly international assistance, which gets covered with barnacles by Congress saying do this, do this, do this, do this, and there isn't enough money to do all those different things. I think it's too soon to say whether it's made a difference or not, but it's important work, and it over time will make a difference.